What if I told you the Civil War didn't just reshape America politically? When we think of the Civil War, we picture Lincoln, Gettysburg, and soldiers clashing on muddy fields. You know, pictures like these. But beyond the battle lines, the war set off ripple effects that transformed American culture in ways most of us never think about. This isn't just another video about generals and strategies. Instead, we're going to uncover the strange and rather human legacies of the Civil War. Because the Gilded Age that followed wasn't just tycoons, smokestacks, and steel, it was ordinary people trying to make sense of a country forever changed. And in that rebuilding, new pastimes, new technologies, and even new beliefs about life after death began to take root. Soldiers killing time with makeshift baseball games turned into America's pastime. The first battlefield amputee refused to settle for a crude wooden peg, sparking a revolution in prosthetic limbs. And grieving families, desperate for closure, turned to séances and eerie spirit photography, chasing comfort in the shadows of grief. These aren't just dusty textbook facts. They're living, breathing stories of how Americans coped, created, and reimagined their world in the aftermath of war. The Civil War is often remembered as one of America's darkest and most transformative moments, a conflict that split the nation and left over 600,000 Americans dead. It's taught in classrooms as a story of emancipation, strategy, and sacrifice, and rightly so. But what often gets lost in the retelling is how the war's ripple effects stretch far beyond the battlefield. You see, it didn't just end with a Appomattox. The war's end unleashed these forces on a national scale, accelerating America's transformation from a rural agriculture society into the urban industrial powerhouse we know today. When we think of the Gilded Age, names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, or Vanderbilt usually come to mind. Towering industrialists who shaped the economy. But if you peel back the surface, you find something far more human. Veterans, families, and communities carried the war's experiences into everyday life, often in unexpected ways. Think of it like this. If the Civil War was the earthquake, the Gilded Age was the aftershock. People got competitive, modern medicine boomed, and your mom started hearing her dead uncle when she took a leak at night. If you had to guess America's most popular sport today, most people would probably say baseball, or whatever this is.
Oh my God, bro, I feel it for both of them, honestly.
Oh my Lord. KOG always a character.
But rewind to the mid-1800s and baseball was just a quirky pastime played in a few cities, mostly New York. It wasn't the national pastime yet. It was more of a hobby for urban clubs. That all changed thanks to the Civil War. Before 1861, baseball wasn't yet a national sport. It was more of a northern game, played in New York, Boston, and other urban centers. The rules varied widely, and many Americans had never even heard of it. The Civil War changed that. Soldiers from the North brought bats, balls, and a few scraps of written rules into their camps. In the long stretches between battles, men passed the time by organizing games. These matches were more than recreation. They built morale, created camaraderie, and gave soldiers a sense of normalcy in the chaos of war. What's more, Union soldiers often played in front of curious local onlookers. Confederate soldiers, prisoners of war, and Southern civilians saw the game for the first time. The war, in effect, carried baseball far beyond its northern roots. By the war's end in 1865, baseball was no longer just a regional pastime. It had become a truly national sport. Veterans brought it back to their hometowns, and soon, clubs sprang up across the country. The game's rapid growth in the Gilded Age, professional teams, leagues, and stadiums, was directly tied to the way the Civil War spread the sport. So while the Civil War tore the country apart, it also gave America something that would bring generations together. The crack of the bat, the cheer of the crowd, and those overpriced but delicious hot dogs. When Union and Confederate soldiers weren't drilling, marching, or fighting, they needed something, anything, to pass the endless hours in camp. I mean, God, could you imagine it back then? And they didn't have Nintendo Switches. Well, baseball turned out to be perfect. It was cheap, easy to learn, and could be played with just two items, a bat and a ball, and sometimes those items could be interchangeable. War correspondents wrote about soldiers playing baseball between skirmishes, sometimes even drawing illustrations of men in uniform swinging bats and running bases. The public back home began associating baseball with patriotism and national identity, something that felt unifying, which is strange considering we were in a civil war. Listen to this story. At Salisbury Confederate Prison in 1862, both Union prisoners of war and their Confederate guards found common ground when they started playing baseball together. According to the observers at the camp, baseball games happened almost daily, with Union POWs actually teaching the game to their captors. Captain James Hall of the 24th Alabama Regiment recounted an image of his men playing baseball just like schoolboys, while waiting near Dalton, Georgia. This shows how quickly the game took root across regional lines. A war fought with muskets and cannons ended up planting the seeds for stadiums, leagues, and legends. See, It wasn't all that bad, right? Right? When the Civil War broke out in 1861, neither side was prepared for the medical challenges ahead. Disease, infection, and battlefield injuries quickly turned doctors into some of the most overworked and resourceful figures of the war. Anesthesia was limited, but surprisingly, chloroform and ether were already in use, so amputations weren't done with soldiers fully awake. Sanitation was extremely poor back then. You see, the germ theory wasn't widely accepted yet, so instruments were often reused without sterilization. Gross. And furthermore, disease killed more people than bullets did. Typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed 2 soldiers for every 1 lost to combat. Doctors faced overwhelming numbers of wounded men and had to act quickly. Amputations became the most common surgery because removing a shattered limb was often the only chance to save a life. The Civil War left behind a staggering human toll, not just in lives lost, but in lives permanently changed. Over 60,000 soldiers had amputations during the war, the result of devastating battlefield injuries and the primitive medical tools at the time. In 1861, an 18-year-old Confederate cavalryman by the name of James Edward Hanger suffered what's considered the first battlefield amputation of the war. A cannonball straight to the leg in the Battle of Philippi. Damn. Faced with a crude wooden peg leg that didn't suit him, Hanger took matters into his own hands. Drawing on determined grit, he crafted a new prosthesis from whittled barrel stabs, rubber bumpers replacing the traditional catgut tendons, and movable hinges at both the knee and ankle for more natural motion. His design was so effective that the state of Virginia commissioned him to produce prosthetic limbs for other wounded soldiers. In 1863, Hanger secured a Confederate patent for his Hanger limb, and went on to establish a prosthetic manufacturing business, one that still exists today as Hanger Clinic. So yeah, for many veterans, surviving meant living without arms or legs. And that reality sparks something few people think about when they think of that time: an entire industry built around artificial limbs. For the first time in American history, the federal government stepped in to fund prosthetics for disabled veterans. This wasn't just charity. It was seen as a duty to the soldiers who had sacrificed everything to this conflict. The government even partnered with manufacturers, setting standards and paying for limbs. That decision created demand on a scale never seen before, and suddenly, prosthetic makers had an incentive to innovate. You see, before the Civil War, prosthetics were just like crude wooden pegs or things you saw on Pirates of the Caribbean. After the war, dozens of patents like James's were filed for new designs. Inventors experimented with hinges, springs, and lightweight materials to make limbs more functional and lifelike. The Palmer leg, one of the most famous designs of the era, used clever joint mechanisms that gave amputees more natural movement, and it won a ton of awards at international exhibitions. In a strange way, wartime tragedy had accelerated modern medicine technology. This prosthetics boom also paved way for a larger shift in medicine and industry. Techniques for molding, fitting, and customizing artificial limbs fed into the growing field of medical devices in the Gilded Age. The concept of mass-producing healthcare solutions, something we take for granted now, was seeded in these workshops. It's easy to think of the Civil War only in terms of destruction, but stories like this remind us that even in the darkest times, human creativity found ways to adapt. The sight of prosthetic shops booming in post-war America is a reminder that the Gilded Age wasn't just gilded with steel and railroads, it was also brimming with invention born from necessity. From the veterans who walked, marched, or even danced again thanks to these devices, that innovation was life-changing. Alright, our last section here is a bit of a weird one, but hear me out. It is getting a little late anyways. Not every legacy of the Civil War was industrial or practical. Some of them were downright spooky. Because when you have a war that leaves hundreds of thousands dead, with families often never seeing the bodies of their loved ones again, people start looking for answers in unusual places. And that's how the Civil War helped spark America's obsession with ghost stories. The sheer scale of grief in those years is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Entire communities lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Communication was slow, battlefields were chaotic, and soldiers were buried in mass graves with no markers. Families weren't just mourning, they were left in limbo, never knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones. Out of that emptiness came a desperate hunger for connection. This desperation fed directly into the rise of spiritualism, a movement that promised to bridge the gap between the living and the departed. Séances became widely popular in the 1860s, with families gathering around tables in candlelit rooms, waiting for knocks, whispers, or ghostly touches from the other side. Mediums claimed they could summon spirits, and for a grieving nation, those promises felt irresistible. And give these people a break, will ya? They lost a lot. And they also didn't have the internet to fact check all this. What had been a fringe belief before the war suddenly exploded into mainstream culture. And here's where it gets really interesting. Back in the Gilded Age, a photographer named William Mumler accidentally snapped what looked like a ghost in one of his photos. At first, it was just him with the faint image of his cousin, who had already passed away, standing right beside him. People went nuts for this. Suddenly, everyone wanted their own spirit photo, a family portrait with a ghostly loved one peeking through the background. His most famous picture? Mary Todd Lincoln, supposedly with a ghost of Abraham Lincoln behind her. Some swore it was real, others called it a total scam. Mumler even got dragged into court for this, with P.T. Barnum himself testifying against him. But he was acquitted and his eerie photos kept circulating around everywhere. And honestly, that says a lot. Because in a time when grief was everywhere, even the possibility of a staged image was enough to comfort people. Just the idea that maybe, somehow, their loved ones were still with them. What started as a coping mechanism soon turned into entertainment though. Newspapers ran stories of haunted battlefields and mediums and spirit photographers toured the country. Even the White House wasn't immune to this. I guess Mary Lincoln didn't get enough of seeing her dead husband because she held seances in the White House all the time. By the Gilded Age, America wasn't just industrializing, it was diving headfirst into a cultural obsession with the supernatural. And here's the kicker. This fascination didn't fade when the century turned. Civil War battlefields like Gettysburg are still considered some of the most haunted places in America. Ghost tours, horror novels, Hollywood horror films, all of them can trace their lineage back to this period when grief and mystery collided. The Civil War didn't just leave scars on the land, it left a lasting impact in the American imagination that we can still see today. And that's the fascinating part. The Civil War didn't just reshape politics or America itself. It gave rise to baseball as a national pastime. It sparked a boom in prosthetic technology that laid the groundwork for modern medical devices. And it even fueled America's imagination from ghost stories to folklore that still lives on today. These aren't just stories that make it into most textbooks, but they're the threads that connect the war to the Gilded Age and to us. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Civil War's hidden legacies. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our other videos on this channel. Until next time, stay curious.